All right. Thank you very much, Deb. So this planning grant that we have is 1 year of funding for us as a research team to meet with our stakeholders, which we are using the US Forest Service kind of 7-region map. And within each of those regions, we're identifying stakeholders kind of across the spectrum of the tree supply chain. And Deb will talk more about all of that process here in a minute, but we're using these conversations with them to help vet and develop ideas of where we can tackle this research. All of us on the research team in different ways in our own experience and our own work have ideas about where some of the problems or levers or valves might be that we might be able to tweak, or ideas about how we can change and shape communication lines between the consumers and the producers and so on. But those are our ideas. We really need to get the kind of on the ground, real world conversations that are occurring in all of these stakeholder meetings. We've begun to hold a few of those already, and we'll continue to hold those over the next few months. What we're interested in from this advisory group is when we're done and we have the output from these regional conversations amongst these different stakeholders, is to really kind of run that up the flagpole with all of you and to see if what we're hearing is maybe an echo of a smaller problem that just happens to be very regional, or if this is something that we really are seeing at a national level and we think that there's an opportunity to do something with. So when we're done with our stakeholder input process, the regional process, we're going to bring this back to all of you to help weigh in and really point us in the directions of where you think there might be tangible research problems to be tackled. What we identify out of this process between the stakeholders and all of your input is what goes into our next grant proposal. And that's really the purpose of this planning grant from the USDA. It's 1 year of funding to get your ducks in a row, to figure out the problem, and to really make the better pitch for what to do about it. So then we apply for the capacity grant, or the CAP grant, which is typically a 5-year grant. It can run in the multiple millions of dollars. And then in that grant, and potentially future grants after that, are where we will do our part to tackle some of those research problems, to identify if it's a communications issue, if it's an economics issue, and we need to look at some different models of how we buy and sell trees in the US, whatever the case is. And so really that's where this planning process feeds into that ultimate research process, where we're going to try to do the things that we learned here. So that's where this is always going. And so within a few months, when we've completed the stakeholder input sessions, we'll be bringing you all back together to kind of show and tell what we found, and for you to help us sharpen the pencil, if you will, and make sure that we have a really solid grant proposal for that CAP grant. All right. Deb, do you want to talk a little bit about what you found? So Deb, in her PhD work with Andrew Kosher, who's the co-lead on this project, she essentially did this process that we're talking about at a national scale within the state of Florida. And so why don't you talk a little bit about both the process and your findings, and we'll see if some of those scale nationally. Take it, Deb.
All right. So yeah, last year we ran a series of focus groups in Florida, really to address this issue, but at a more regional scale. And our stakeholders were really similar to the ones we're using for this study. We were working with city arborists, urban foresters, growers, and landscape designers. And the goal was to understand, through our conversations with them, why we have a limited palette of tree species available and planted, and then how they, the stakeholders, might approach expanding this palette. So really was to gather as much information from them as possible, and then see how it could be expanded to start solving the low species issue. Again, this is the framework that we took And the reason we chose growers, arborists, municipal urban foresters, and landscape architects and other designers is really we are working with this part of the funnel, the part that involves that feedback loop where there seems to be a breakdown of communication between the purchasers and the producers. And so that was the idea for selecting those specific stakeholders. These are the ones who are growing wholesale on a large scale, and the purchasers who are purchasing regularly at a large scale. So the focus groups were comprised of groups of about, I think in the end, we had about 6 to 8 in each group. And again, they represented these different kind of stakeholder groups or professions. And we had 3 separate groups of 3 separate groups of people. So we wanted to get as much information as possible. And our groups represented stakeholders from the entire state of Florida, which is important because here in Florida, we kind of have about 3 horticultural regions based on where a lot of the growing takes place and purchasing takes place. And this is something we had to consider for the national project that we're working on now, is that there can be regional differences in the supply chains. These groups were 90 minutes. We recorded them using Zoom. I read through the transcripts a lot. And then some of the questions were aimed at specific stakeholders. For example, we asked growers specifically what influences their decision to grow certain trees. And then we switched over and asked the purchasers the same question. And then other questions were posed to the entire group. But the facilitation happened in such a way where we were trying to get the participants to talk to each other a lot too. And that happened. They were really good at feeding off of each other, asking each other for follow-ups, clarification. And this was kind of like a microcosm example of how these different stakeholder groups really can learn a lot by just communicating, which they don't always get the chance to. And then as far as the analysis goes, it was a mix of inductive and deductive coding. So it came in with specific questions, but then we also looked for patterns that just emerged organically. A recruitment rate of about 50. Overall, we had 19 participants for this study. And again, a range of professions and years in the profession, which is good. Okay, so this is probably what you're more interested in, are the factors. So after listening and watching their discussions, the factors that influence production, so the things that growers voiced, really showed that they have a complex decision-making process. I think one of them described it as a crystal ball because there's just so many factors going on year to year that they have to consider. And some of the major factors included a need to maximize production and sales, so a very economic approach, minimize expenses, and minimize risk. Risk came up quite frequently with them. Here are some of the other factors they mentioned. So growth rate of the tree came up several times, production ease, which kind of plays into minimizing cost. And again, risk was really big. But overall, it seems like a lot of their decisions come down to the economics. So what is their demand for and what have they've been able to sell? This was an interesting quote that came up, and it fueled a lot of back and forth discussions in one of our focus groups. And the grower said, growers are incentivized by the market to find fast growing trees. And as someone analyzing the data, this is very interesting to me. And I think Andrew and some others found this interesting too. The example the grower gave was they had been growing 2 different cultivars of crepe myrtles. One took about 5 years total for production. The other one took about 8 years. They were wanting to charge more for the one that took 8 years because it took more resources on their part to grow. But the purchasers didn't get why it was more expensive. All they saw were 2 trees that were the same height, same caliper. And that kind of different experience and viewpoint of what they were seeing between the growers and the purchasers ultimately just led the growers to give up on the shorter growing species and just focus on the fast growing species because they couldn't get people to pay more for it. And I've heard this a couple times during these discussions. So for the purchaser side of things, so the arborists, municipal foresters, the designers who are doing large scale developments, the factors that came up really came down to the site conditions. So what is the urban site that the tree is going into? The function of the tree, so whether it's aesthetics, ecological, etc. And also regulations. So tree ordinances, codes, approved species list. These came up over and over again as being major influences in what the purchasers decide to select and plant. Here's some others. So you can tell they had a lot. The people purchasing trees have to think about a lot when they're deciding what to plant. So availability came up a lot. Clients and residents. So what do the people who have the trees in their yards actually want? Regulations, again, was huge. Tree size also came up quite a bit. And then there were other things. So historical and cultural values. So if an area is known for something, and in our case in Florida, a lot of our coastal cities are known for having palm trees and a tropical look. That can actually have a huge influence. And it's significant. So again, these were just some of the factors coming up. A designer gave a really good quote to explain what goes through their mind when they're selecting trees. And so they said, "We design to what the site is and what we want to accomplish on that site. I think being mindful of diversity is really important, but also the aesthetics of an urban place and the function of the place is very important." Okay, so during these discussions, we also pulled out the constraints to expanding species diversity. Again, regulations were voiced as being a constraint several times in each of our focus groups. Site conditions, that one probably doesn't surprise any of us. That tough urban sites can limit what goes into the ground. Again, historical and cultural values. In many cases, municipal foresters wanted to plant more diversity, but they were limited because the surrounding community wanted to keep a certain feel to the city. Tree size, this came up quite a bit in our Florida groups. I'm curious to see if this comes up in the national level, but many of them voiced a need for smaller stature trees, so small trees at maturity. So instead of the big, large canopy shade trees, a lot of them want more understory trees that they can put into smaller spaces or intersperse underneath the large trees. Again, availability, and then the client resident desires all seem to be big constraints. This just kind of repeats some of these constraints that they voiced. So here is a quote from a grower that is really voicing some of the disconnect between the grower's experience and the purchaser's experience. And so this person said, "Now that the industry has matured, it's almost like we're Walmart or Amazon, and that people literally will call the day before and want trees the next day. You know, we're not making widgets in a factory. You can't just ramp up production." And this came up quite a bit from growers, where they are feeling an immense pressure as urbanization is growing and tree planting is growing. Yay! There's also a demand and an expectation that growers are just going to have tons of trees and the exact specifications that purchasers want. There were some opportunities that came up though, which is good. So two of the most widely discussed opportunities were education. So educating on the importance of tree species diversity was voiced over and over again. For example, I think there were two separate landscape architects who said they used to plant the same species over and over again, respect the same species over and over again, until they took an ISA class and learned about tree diversity, and then they changed their ways. So it was really as simple as just attending a class or watching a lecture, and they changed their behavior, which again, that's like two very minor anecdotes, but I think it does hint at some opportunities. And then stakeholder willingness to collaboratively support diversity efforts with other green industry stakeholders. So over and over again, the stakeholders in our focus groups said that they enjoyed having this discussion and they wanted to have more of these discussions. So I think that's a huge takeaway, is that there is a desire to talk between the different parts of this purchasing chain. And that's important because that seems to be one of the main points of breakdown that's causing this feedback loop with availability. Some other things that they talked about, contract growing came up a lot. That's been proven in a couple parts of the country to be a successful way to increase diversity. Experimentation, changing the regulations to allow for more diversity, etc. Okay, so another designer had a really good quote to encapsulate the opportunities. So they said, I don't think you can solve this problem without, really creating that collaboration across the entire chain, which is a beautiful summary of the opportunities that they voiced. Okay, so that's the Florida focus group, and this is really what provided the data to support our methods for the SCRI project, so the project we're working on now. So what we did, I'm just going to hop right into it, Grant, if that's fine. Okay, so what we're doing for this project right now is we're doing a stakeholder input process, which includes all of you on this call. And then we're going to share what we found through dissemination. And we're also going to do it through an international tree conference, which will also provide an opportunity for more conversations. And then from those three phases, we'll develop that CAP grant, which Grant talked about a little bit already. So for phase one, the stakeholder input process, woo, big picture. The most important thing that you need to know right now is we are having our all stakeholders meeting, our kickoff meeting. That is literally what's happening right now. So this is with our advisory committee, all of you, and we are talking about the goals, the vision, the process. And we also want to hear from you about what other things we should be considering as we move on. Like Grant said, we have already moved into the next part of the stakeholder meetings, which is the regional focus groups. So we've had one focus group already, and we structured this methodology really similar to the Florida focus group study. One of the main differences is it is at a national level now. So we use the Forest Service regions as a way to break up our focus groups. We have had the Eastern region so far. We're about to have the Southern region. And these focus groups, again, are made up of the kind of key players in the growing and purchasing cycle for trees that end up in urban areas. The difference with this group, the meetings are a little bit longer, so they're 2 hours because the meetings are also a little bit bigger, where we have 8 to 12 people instead of 6 to 8 for these meetings, really to encapsulate the larger regions that we're working with. We're asking really similar questions that we did in the Florida focus group. Again, some are aimed at the growers, some are aimed at the designers, but overall we're trying to just facilitate a discussion to get at these key questions. And the analysis is going to be very similar to the Florida one. So once we finish these, which will end in mid-February, we're going to do the analysis to try to capture the key findings from these regional focus groups. And then we'll share that with a closeout meeting or a wrap-up meeting, which will be all of you. Again, it will be just like this, but it'll be coming back together, seeing what we found, and trying to prioritize where to go next. Okay, so after that, we are going to have an international conference that's focused on tree diversity. So this is part of the planning grant, was to have some sort of meeting to discuss this topic. And so this one's going to be Urban Tree Diversity 4. So it's actually going to be the fourth of a series of international meetings focused specifically on urban tree diversity. It just worked out that they needed the fourth meeting to happen this year, and we needed to have a meeting about urban tree diversity this year. And so we're like, hey, let's join forces and have it together. So we're going to have it in Tampa Bay in August, and it's going to be a hybrid in-person and virtual event. It's going to be 2 days long. The first day is going to be kind of your typical talks and seminars. Then there'll be a field trip and then a facilitated discussion, really similar to the focus group discussion, so that people at the conference who decide to stick around can participate in another discussion on this topic. And that will provide more data and information for us as we create the CAP proposal. Speaking of which, again, Grant kind of touched on this, so I won't talk too much, but the idea is to consolidate the findings from all these meetings and discussions to create a much larger picture with some lofty but achievable and important goals, one of which would be to improve the production efficiency, handling, and processing, and long-term productivity and profitability of urban tree growers. So to help those growers start producing a greater variety of trees and make it sustainable, and then make their overall operations and the resulting urban forest more resilient to emerging pests and pathogens. So that's the big picture. That's what we're heading towards. And we plan to apply for this in the spring of 2023. So next cycle, and that'll give us enough time to make sense of everything we're gathering right now, to have the conference and see if we need to add any more information or make changes based on the conference, and get plenty of feedback, because this is a pretty intensive project proposal. Here is a summary of the timeline. So I'm just starting from where we're at right now. We're having this kickoff meeting. We're also having focus groups this month. And then next month, we're going to have more focus groups. We're going to analyze the data, analyze some more data in March. And then April will be the final stakeholder meeting. So that'll be the wrap-up meeting. And then May, June, and July is when we're going to be disseminating some of the findings. It'll probably also happen a little bit after the conference as well. But this is something that's going to involve writing a white paper, also presenting at regional trade shows and conferences and meetings, and sharing with our stakeholders what we're doing, what we found, and really boosting support for the larger CAP grant. And then again, in August, we'll have our diversity conference. So that's what we're doing. I'm going to hand it over. And now's the time where we can kind of discuss this, and you can ask questions or give feedback or ideas. Thank you.